Laura Parodi is no stranger here, and I think that calls for a different kind of introduction. I gave a long version of her CV last time, and most of you here know who she is. And for the few that don't, you can easily find out about her. So as recently as 2010-11, she was an Aga Khan postdoctoral fellow at Harvard and at MIT. And right now she's here to pursue research on a book project which will be a Locarno supplement on early Mughal ceremonial that she's working on in collaboration with Professor Wheeler Thaxton, who has joined us from his sort of semi-occultation. It's nice to see him here. And Laura will shortly return to Italy, where she'll meet some teaching obligations in the summer and the fall, and join Team 5, sort of European things. Team 5 of the Comparative Oriental Manuscript Studies, which is a program of the European Science Foundation, and she might, well, try and tell us a little bit about that later. She'll speak tonight about another project, which is focused on the Chahārbāghs, which she will argue tonight serves several specialized functions that included hosting the activities of the court. A thorough review of archaeological and textual evidence has cast doubt about their presumed ubiquity in the Islamic world, as well as their identification, their wholesale identification with four-part gardens with paradisiacal connotations. So the lecture tonight locates the Chahārbāghs as a specific historical phenomenon and calls textual sources to differentiate aspects of their form and function under the Timurid, Safavid, and Mughal dynasties, though my impression of the lecture is that it's more Mughal focused. So the lecture title you see, Chahārbāghs, Palaces, and Mughal Court Routine in the 16th Century. Please join me in welcoming her.
So thank you, David, for this really thorough introduction, and thanks to the Aga Khan program at Harvard University and the Aga Khan program at MIT for supporting my research for the past couple of years. And the Chahārbāgh, as I hope to demonstrate tonight, was a special type of garden that became the setting for many activities of the Timurid court, as well as the early Mughal court under Babur and Humayun. During the 16th century, the use of Chahārbāghs was discontinued by the Mughals, and the functions of the Chahārbāgh were mostly taken over by the palace. Why this happened is an interesting research question. And in order to properly address this question, it's necessary, I would suggest, to briefly reconsider the current view that identifies the Chahārbāgh with a timeless form of alleged pre-Islamic origin, a paradisiacal garden divided into 4 quarters. Such a reconstruction, as we shall see, is not supported, I would argue, either by archaeological or by textual evidence. I know it sounds strange, but... And secondly, it's necessary to examine, to try and find out what the Chahārbāgh actually was in the Timurid and the Mughal context, and how it functioned in relation to court routine, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on tonight. And finally, I will briefly examine the broader implications of this reconstruction. So even though voices of dissent and skepticism have been raised by various scholars, the expression Chahārbāgh is still widely used as a shorthand for a perfectly square garden with cross-axial channels or walkways and a pavilion or pool at the center. The plan is usually regarded as quintessentially Islamic, and yet it is believed to perpetuate an ancient Iranian or perhaps even Mesopotamian concept representing or scheme representing the cosmos with its 4 directions. Such a form allegedly would have survived intact from ancient times to the Sasanian era, from which Islam would have inherited it. So this is the narrative we have received. But there are serious reasons to question it. The narrative would seem to originate with the Survey of Persian Art in the 30s, more specifically in the chapter on gardens in the 2nd volume of the survey, signed jointly by Arthur Upham Pope and his wife Phyllis Ackerman, but authored, I believe, largely by the latter, The reason I'm suggesting this is that Ackerman considered Iranian gardens and cosmic diagrams in at least 2 further publications, pictured here and meant to accompany the 1940 exhibition of Persian art in New York, which was one of the first introductions for the West to Iranian art. The views expressed in the survey may be summarized as follows. The word Chahārbāghs literally means 4 gardens. Therefore, the concept relates to the ancient Mesopotamian idea of the king as the ruler of the 4 directions, the 4 quarters of the world, and finds a close parallel in the Garden of Eden in Genesis with its 4 rivers. As was typical of such early efforts to position non-Western traditions, Ackerman adopts a comparative stance and uses the Bible on the one hand and classical sources on the other as a compass. At the same time, the survey of Persian art, or this chapter in particular, I believe reflects concerns typical of the early 20th century in its attempt at defining the national character of Iranian art, the unique genius of the Persians. And in the case of gardens, this meant a specific type of Persian garden had to be identified. The expression Chahārbāghs, found in some Persian language sources, seemed to satisfy these premises, as long as it was understood literally as 4 gardens. And this Ackerman then connected with Mesopotamia and the biblical Eden. She did not discuss the Quran. She did not consider the Quran and was not concerned with Islamic gardens because of the context. So, even though Ackerman's method is viewed with skepticism today, and here you have some excerpts from the Encyclopedia Iranica Online entry, her ideas on gardens still loom large. And perhaps this is because they were embraced so enthusiastically in the 1970s, when Islamic garden studies began to emerge as a distinct area of research. The 1970s were, after all, I would argue, all about comparison and comparatism, And my survey seems to indicate that it was in the 70s that the emphasis shifted from Persian gardens as the expression of a nation's genius to Islamic gardens as a universal concept, again in accordance with the prevalent approach to Islamic art at the time, or with the emerging approach to Islamic art at the time, I'd say. As a result, the Quran was weaved into the narrative. Just as Islam had inherited certain conceptions about the afterlife, most notably the 4 rivers of paradise or the 2 and 2 gardens of paradise, so the story goes, it readily adopted from Sasanian Iran the ancient cross-axial paradise garden form. This double lineage is still seen in the narrative, as it relies on the one hand on a diffusionist model emanating from Persia, and on the other hand on a connection with the Quran as an Islamic universal. So the purported existence of cross-axial gardens in Sasanian Iran is a classic example of a meme that has been repeated over and over without citing a single piece of scholarly evidence, let's say. Again, the starting point is the chapter on gardens in the Survey of Persian Art, where a vague reference is made to a cross-axis that purportedly would have existed in Sasanian palace designs. A cross-axis that Ackerman defines in the Imarat-e Khosro as implied in the staircases of this facade. And in Haushkuri, because there were traces of these channels. In addition, Ackerman cites the following in a footnote, admittedly, but I'll leave you to read it. I don't think these 2 channels were meant to cross, because putting wine and milk together is not a good idea anyway, but and particularly in a Zoroastrian context. But so small wonder that subsequent scholars never include a footnote in support of their claim that Sasanian gardens were cross-axial, even as they continue to refer to this meme. This includes, of course, most notably several titles written in the 70s and 80s, and more recently, maybe I don't have that one, an entry titled Chahārbāghs in the Encyclopedia Iranica. Reuters, for his part, does not discuss Sasanian gardens in his chapter on Sasanian architecture in the Survey of Persian Art. And even De Morgan, who published plans, and the one on the right is from De Morgan's volume of 1896, even De Morgan does not suggest the presence of four-part gardens. He did not interpret those remains as evidence of four-part gardens. As you're doubtlessly aware, these sites were severely damaged during the Iran-Iraq War and are unlikely to yield any further information, but still very, very tenuous kind of evidence to begin with. So remains of Achaemenian gardens, or actually of one Achaemenian garden, only first emerged in the early 1960s. And the information was only gradually incorporated into the main narrative, as three different reconstructions were successively proposed by the archaeologists who excavated the site, David Stronach. The earliest reconstruction, as you can see, reproduces the archaeological evidence, or an interpretation thereof, and there's just this line of channels. Then the other two are efforts to read a cross-axial scheme by then believed to be quintessentially Iranian, where there clearly is no evidence for one. So in the first or second reconstruction, but first attempt to read it as a cross-axial, as a four-part garden, we see Stronach introduces the possibility of a visual axis. So he says, well, you know, the ruler would have sat there. There is a platform. There is a slightly wider intercolumnar breadth. So he must have been sitting there looking at the garden. And then a few years later, this turns into a fully fledged four-part garden. And in the second, in this third publication, he explains that given the ubiquitousness of the four-part plan in later periods, there was no reason to doubt that this garden too had a cross-axial layout. And this is repeated in the entry of the Encyclopedia Iranica by the same author. And you have an excerpt here. So, okay. Interestingly, this entry was supposed to be followed by, this is just on the early period, it was supposed to be continued for the Sasanian, etc. periods. It never was. Well, maybe there are other reasons too, but it's difficult to write something on the Sasanian period. So much for pre-Islamic evidence. In the Islamic context, generations of scholars have relied on Ernst Herzfeld's reconstructions of the 9th century caliphal palaces of Samarra, first published in 1912, including, relevant to our topic, the so-called Balkuwara. This is how Herzfeld reconstructed the courtyards of the Balkuwara. It's the watercolor that was then reproduced in print. However, as previously noted by Alistair Northedge, Herzfeld's original drawings do not include these cross-axial channels. And this is how Northedge, and I'm sorry it's a bit bright, publishes the Balkuwara in 2007. So there are he just puts these dotted channels. Now, having examined the relevant materials in the Herzfeld archives at the Freer Gallery of Art, I'm not so sure, but then again, it's certainly not a four-part arrangement. What the drawings show is a channel coming in from one side in two of the courtyards. And here is a detail, and I'm sorry these images are pixelized. They're downloaded from the Smithsonian online collections, but I'm in the process of acquiring the actual image. So what we see is that traces of something that we could interpret as a kind of as a channel that perhaps fed a pool in the middle of the courtyard, but certainly not strong evidence in support of a four-part garden. Now, interestingly, in 1907, and I don't have a picture for that, unfortunately, in the publication Aufnahmen und Untersuchungen zur islamischen Archäologie, Herzfeld included cross-axial channels, not in the courtyard of the mosque of Al-Mutawakkil. Sorry, so just there's another Samarran monument where he had earlier suggested this, and again. the original drawing, which is here, shows only one channel. So from one channel, he turned this into 4. Now, you'd wish things were so simple, but here things are slightly complicated by a photograph where you see this. We don't have a comparable photograph for the Balkawara, but still, I mean, I don't know exactly what to make of this. Maybe Jim Westcott, who knows more about water, including wadis and things, will have some ideas in the discussion. But again, I don't think this supports the idea that there were these cross-axial gardens. So that leaves us with very little evidence. If we cross out Samarra, the only secure evidence for cross-axial designs is found basically in 2 regions, too distant in time and space to postulate a direct connection. Al-Andalus in the 11th century, or from the 11th century onwards, and these are courtyards, not gardens, and India, more specifically the Mughal Empire and the Deccan from the 16th century. In addition, there is a pavilion with staircases on all 4 sides that was found at Rusafa in Syria, and which has been dated to the Umayyad period. But, I mean, I don't think we have much to build a whole theory on. So, if the Chahārbāghs is not a timeless universal form, as this review of the archaeological evidence suggests, then what is it? And of the historiography. Scholars have long been aware that the expression Chahārbāghs gained currency during the 15th century in the Timurid Empire, and particularly in the latter half of the 15th century. Samarkandi and Isfizari both refer to a Chahārbāghs of Shah Rukh in Mashhad, where the Timurid ruler resided when visiting the shrine. It is first mentioned in relation to events of 1418. But it is in the second half of the 15th century that sources more frequently refer to Chahārbāghs. So Samarkandi, Mirkhand, Khandamir all mention Chahārbāghs several times. And among the Chahārbāghs in Herat was that of Mir Ali Shir Navoi, built in 1499 at the shrine of Gazurgah. And there were a few more. And Chahārbāghs are also mentioned at other locations. For example, in Balkh, the Chahārbāghs of Ibrahim Sultan Mirza, the son of Shah Rukh, and again in Balkh, that of Amir Mazid Arghun. In Samarkand, interestingly, only one Chahārbāghs is mentioned, and it's mentioned in the Baburnameh. The Chahārbāghs of Darwish Muhammad Tarkhan, who was, one might say, the kingmaker during the reign of Sultan Ahmad Mirza bin Abu Sa'id in the last decades of the 15th century. Timur's gardens are invariably called Bagh, not Chahārbāghs. So here we begin to see a pattern, I would argue, because the Chahārbāghs would seem to be connected exclusively with members of the royal family or the highest ranking emirs. I've not provided a complete list, but I plan to do so in print. In addition, textual sources provide information about the form and the function of the Chahārbāghs. Let us consider each in turn, beginning with the form. There's hardly any doubt that Chahārbāghs were large estates, regularly laid out and terraced, containing a variety of fruit and non-fruit trees, flowers and other crops such as vines, and featuring certain architectural provisions. This description corresponds with textual description found in a treatise composed in Herat in 1514 under Safavid rule. The author, Qasim bin Yusuf, gathered information from Sayyid Nizamuddin Amir Sultan Mahmud, also known as Miraki Said Giyas, a member of the late Sultan Hussein Mirza's court, who came from a family of gardeners. Typical of this period, I would argue, the Sayyid, who was also an Amir, who was also a gardener, etc. The treatise is well known to scholarship. Marieva Saptelny has written extensively about it. And Mirak and his team, including a Mullah Qasim, that is probably the same Qasim who authored the treatise, again, scholarship, well known to scholarship, later built gardens for Babur in Hindustan, and Mirak's son supervised the building of Humayun's tomb complex in Delhi. So there is a connection in this period between the Timurid and the Mughal traditions. The Irshad Azira was dedicated to Shah Ismail Safavi and was written at the end of a devastating famine. Its purpose was to demonstrate the importance of agriculture for political stability, and perhaps to introduce the Safavids to the gardening tradition of Herat and Khorasan. 7 of the 8 chapters deal with various aspects of gardening, from irrigation to grafting, food preserves, while the 8th and final chapter describes a chahārbāgh. Among the main components of the chahārbāgh mentioned in the Irshad al-Zira are a platform, kursi, featuring a pavilion, imarat, with a pool house facing it, fed by a channel called shājuī. Now, shājuī I haven't found elsewhere, but the other terminology recurs over and over, so it seems to be consistent. A charchaman planted around or perhaps on either side of a clover meadow, containing 4 different types of fruit trees, pomegranate, quince, peach, and pear, and 9 flower beds called nobakche, containing flowers meant to blossom in succession. And I think the trees were also combined so they could provide fruit at different seasons. Other trees and flowers are mentioned, but what I'm concerned with here are these components that bear specific names. So the kursi, the imarat, the house, the charchaman, and again, the nobakche I haven't found elsewhere, but the charchaman is interesting because it recurs in Mughal sources. The description does not always clarify the spatial relationship between the chahārbāgh's components, and as a result, several different reconstructions have been proposed. I'm showing only 2 of them, and there are, I know, at least 2 more, one by Pugachenkova and one by Ralph Pinder Wilson in the Islamic garden. So, chahārbāghs would seem, in turn, at least in some cases, to have been part of even larger complexes. For example, the chahārbāgh of Ali Shir Navoi may have comprised, or alternatively, may have been combined with a baghche. Now, baghche, in my understanding, it's another technical term that's very interesting. In my understanding, it's a self-contained garden. It is a word that, that is used for riverfront gardens in Mughal sources, whether it be rustic orchards on the outskirts of villages in Central Asia, or refined estates of the nobility in Mughal cities. Baghche is also used for the gardens in palatial complexes, and I think what the 2 have in common is the fact of being relatively small, which is what baghche means, and self-contained, so with walls perhaps. Interestingly, in this case, the vocabulary is shared in a region wider than that considered in this paper, because the Ottomans also, so far as I know, seem to have called their palace gardens baghche. So in the case of Ali Shir Navoi's baghche and chahārbāgh in Herat, I think the 2 functioned in a complementary way, because there was a residence in Mir Ali Shir Navoi's chahārbāgh where Sultan Hussein was staying when visiting the shrine. Again, so there was if there was a residence, probably there was a baghche. And here we still haven't clarified what the chahārbāgh then is for. I'll come to it. So, again, probably part of a single complex. Some further information on the connection of the chahārbāgh with other baghs may be garnered from 16th century Mughal sources. For example, while holding court in his Kabul chahārbāgh, Babur was once warned that some of the nobles present at the audience were about to betray him. So he pretended that something was the matter with the ladies in the adjacent Bagh-e-Khalvat and retreated there in order to decide what to do. So this tells us that the 2 were really close and probably part of the same complex. And when a high-ranking senior Timurid lady joined Babur's retinue in Hindustan, Babur ordered a Bagh-e-Khalvat built for her own use. And we find this Bagh-e-Khalvat associated with women a few more times. The episode I just cited, which sees Babur holding court in Kabul's chahārbāgh, points to the chahārbāgh's ceremonial use, or introduces the issue, to which I shall return shortly. This means chahārbāghs were meant to, from the point of view of form, chahārbāghs were meant to accommodate large crowds on occasion. We know that armies encamped in chahārbāghs. Accordingly, chahārbāghs are known to have contained provisions such as a mosque, a hall, a hammam. All 3 are cited in relation to Babur's chahārbāgh in Agra, for example. And a mosque and a hall were also found in Babur's garden complex at Dholpur in Madhya Pradesh, pictured here. The connection between these gardens and Mughal palaces will not be lost on anyone familiar with Mughal court ceremonial in the following centuries. And I would argue that Kabul played a seminal role in this connection, as the first ground on which Babur experimented with Timurid architectural concepts, both palace and gardens. And what intrigues me especially is the parallel reference, which I haven't clarified yet, to a courtyard of audience inside the Kabul citadel and another space for audiences, another divan khane in the Chahārbāgh. The way the garden seems to replicate the residence in its articulation is interesting. And finally, the survival of much of this terminology, much the same terminology in Mughal India. Several passages in the Baburnameh furthermore testify that a slope and vistas were also essential components in a Chahārbāgh. The Chahārbāgh was not a sheltered, confined garden built in opposition to a hostile environment, but it was built in a commanding position so as to see and be seen from the surrounding landscape. This was certainly the case with Babur's gardens in present-day Afghanistan, and Jim Westcott has written about this extensively. And here's an example. I mean, it's an example of the view. And in 1981, Warwick Ball described the remains of a garden outside Herat that he identified as Sultan Hussein's Bagh-e-Jahan-Arai, because it's in that area, where the slope has been created artificially. So the terracing in this case is artificial. The presence of belvederes, takht or takhtgah, is also well documented in Herat. So much the same components, vista and water, are central to Babur's description of the previously cited Chahārbāgh of Darwish Muhammad Dar Khan in Samarkand. Quote, "During the time of Sultan Ahmad Mirza, men of high rank and low built many gardens, large and small. For pleasure, good air, and superb vista, there are few like Darwish Muhammad Dar Khan's Chahārbāgh. It is below the Bagh-e Maidan, one of Timur's own gardens, overlooking the Kolba meadow. The entire meadow lies stretched out below it. Planted in straight lines in the Chahārbāgh are beautiful ornamental trees, cypresses and poplars. It is a truly magnificent spot, the only flaw being the lack of a great stream." Unquote. Note that the presence of ornamental trees rather than fruit trees in this particular garden I think should be understood as a response to the lack of water. Fruit trees require intensive irrigation, but clearly the planting could vary depending on the specific ecology of the site. Babur's description of one of his Chahārbāghs, the Bagh-e-Wafa outside Adinapur in present-day Afghanistan, is also of interest. And everyone is familiar with this iconic image of the Bagh-e-Wafa but this was illustrated over 70 years later. So it does not reflect, it reflects a culture that had abandoned the Chahārbāgh, as I will proceed to demonstrate. But the text reads, the relevant portion of the text, it's longer, reads, quote, in 914, corresponding to 1508, 1509, so this is earlier actually than the Irshad al-Zira'a by a few years. We tend to think one is Timurid, the other is Mughal, but there's some overlap. So in 1914, I had constructed a Chahārbāgh called Bagh-e-Wafa on a rise to the south of the Adinapur fortress. It overlooks the river, which flows between the fortress and the garden. It yields many oranges, citrons, and pomegranates. The year I defeated Pahar Khan and conquered Lahore and Dipalpur, I had a banana tree brought and planted. It thrived. The year before that, sugarcane had been planted. It was becoming good sugarcane, and some of it was being sent to Badakhshan and Bukhara. The ground is high, with constant running water, and the weather is mild in winter. In the middle of the garden, Bagnen Ortasida, pardon my pronunciation, I don't know Chagatai, is a small hill from which a 1 mil stream always flows through the garden. The Charchaman in the middle of the garden, same expression, is situated atop this hill. In the southwest portion of the garden is a 10 by 10 pool surrounded by orange trees, and this is what is illustrated, well, is the text on this page, not necessarily what is illustrated here, but it seems to be the Charchaman. Is a 10 by 10 pool surrounded by orange trees and also some pomegranate trees. All around the pool is a clover meadow. The best place in the garden is there. When the oranges turn yellow, it is a very beautiful sight, really beautifully laid out. So we find the Chahārbāghs, which is a technical term from the Irshad al-Zira, and we find this interesting expression like in the middle of the garden. Where we clearly don't have a flat terrain, so it must mean in the middle in bilateral symmetry, because it's at the top. It's the only explanation. As he clearly says that the Chahārbāghs in the middle of the garden is situated atop the hill, but it's on a slope. We know, I mean, the site is known. So once again, paradise is not mentioned. Instead, we have a terrace garden with a strong emphasis on an agricultural dimension. So it's clearly the same garden culture, I would argue, as the Irshad, because there are similarities. Incidentally, this expression in the middle of Darmiyan, etc., is also found in the Zafarnameh with reference to one of Timur's gardens, to this hill with a palace at the top, and Clavijo mentions the same. And interestingly enough, Thevenot, in his description of the Hizar Jarib, which is another terrace garden, he speaks of a pavilion in the middle of the garden. So what this middle really means, we should find out. I'm not saying it's necessarily at the top, axially positioned, but it could be. In some cases, it seems to be. Finally, it seems to be a constant feature of Chahārbāghs, finally for this section, or at least the royal Chahārbāghs, to be located a certain distance from the city, typically across a river. Again, something that Jim Westcott has written about before. This may simply be because only a suburban location would guarantee a large enough patch of land. But several authors, Jim Westcott, Terry Allen, Maria Schupper, have noted that large suburban estates, particularly in the aftermath of the Timurid demise in the early 16th century, often served as military headquarters and were apparently easier to defend than citadels, especially given that the loyalty of the population could not be guaranteed. It's true of the Safavids in Herat, it's true of Babur in Agra. Whether this applies to Chahārbāghs in the Timurid period is open to question. Speaking of agricultural management and military control, we have implicitly shifted the discussion from form to function. And function rather than form may well be what characterizes the Chahārbāgh, as opposed to a regular bagh, so to say. The reason scholars have been unable to reconcile, and sometimes even to accept, the visual and textual evidence showing that the Chahārbāgh was not a four-part garden is, I would argue, because scholars have interpreted Chahārbāgh as the name for a particular form of garden. But sources, in my opinion, point consistently to a functional dimension that is specific to the Chahārbāgh. More precisely, they seem to indicate a role of the Chahārbāgh, not merely of gardens, but of the Chahārbāgh specifically, with certain aspects of court routine. This role emerges in the Timurid milieu in the 15th century. And during the 16th, the Safavids, Shaybanids, and the so-called Mughals, who were themselves Timurid, adopted and sometimes adapted the Chahārbāgh for new purposes, or even discontinued it altogether. And I'm illustrating this with a feast that was probably hosted in the Chahārbāgh of Kabul. In the Timurid period, as well as the early Mughal and early Safavid period, Chahārbāghs were used as residences by the rulers and by their highest ranking officers, including their male children, probably, I suspect, in their capacity as officers. This explains why Babur had a Chahārbāgh built at every location. Not more than one, but invariably one at every location. Additionally, Chahārbāghs would seem to have been the setting for certain official functions. In particular, stately celebrations such as enthronements, New Year festivals, circumcisions, feasts, or the reception of ambassadors or distinguished guests. Military reviews, we already mentioned, and as we have earlier seen, audiences, what sources call the divan. Although I'm still working on this, some sources seem to suggest that justice was possibly administered in the citadel, maybe because the prison was nearby. In my current understanding, but again, this is research in progress, the divan does not seem to have been in the 15th and early 16th century such a formalized routine as, say, in the Mughal Empire a century later. I'm not even sure that it was a prescribed daily routine. For what I can see, the Timurid rulers' routine was still largely similar, I would argue, to that of Ghaznavid rulers as described by Bayhaqi. They would attend to administrative business daily, but formal audiences were not held every day. By contrast, and not surprisingly, some other aspects of Timurid court ceremonial would seem to hark back to Mongol precedents specifically. And the word used for the celebrations I've listed earlier, the banquets given on the occasion of accession, circumcisions, New Year's festivals, marriages, the reception of ambassador and so forth, is toi, a word of Mongol origin. Whereas other feasts of a more private nature, such as the majlis or sohbat, could take place in various and even informal settings under a tree or in a room, tois are invariably associated with a vast number of people and hosted in Chahārbāghs. So my provisional assessment is some continuity in the use of Chahārbāghs for public functions that seem to be associated most closely with Khorasan, perhaps harking back to the Ghaznavid precedent, and some ceremonial innovation that may be traced back to Mongol precedents. Numerous textual references support this interpretation as the main seat of the Chahārbāgh as the main seat for the court's activities. And I will only cite two examples from the context I'm most familiar with. I will provide more examples in print hopefully soon. The festivities for Humayun's enthronement and Akbar's circumcision in Kabul in 1546 took place in a garden that one source, Bayezid Bayat, describes as the Chahārbāgh, while interestingly another source, Gulbadan, calls it the Bagh-e-Divan Khane, garden of the audience hall. The women feasted simultaneously in the Orta Bagh, middle garden, which again suggests a larger complex is involved. And this is Bayezid Bayat. Gulbadan calls this the Bagh-e-Bika Begum. Bika was Humayun's chief wife. And later probably the real patron of his mausoleum in Delhi, where she paid for the Quran reciters and she resided there until her death. 3 years earlier, Humayun had arrived in Herat as an exile after losing the throne of Hindustan. And the text of a farman of Shah Tahmasp, Safavi, is preserved in Mughal in the Akbarnameh, which gives meticulous instructions down to the number and kind of sweetmeats to be served for a celebration in Humayun's honor to be hosted in Herat's Chahārbāgh, to which, if I'm not mistaken, all the population, all the men from 7 to 70 were supposed to be present, so a really big banquet. What this Chahārbāgh of Herat was, it's open to question, probably again Sultan Hussein's Bagh-e-Jahan Arai, which is never so far as I know, called a Chahārbāgh in sources. Or maybe there's one instance. As mentioned, Babur built a Chahārbāgh at every site, but never more than one, as one would expect if the Chahārbāgh indeed was the seat of the court and the main setting for its activities. On occasion, for example at Gwalior in present-day Madhya Pradesh, the governor's Chahārbāgh is mentioned. Here, the governor's Chahārbāgh, Babur tells us, was outside the Elephant's Gate in Gwalior. And it's mentioned as distinct from Babur's own Chahārbāgh. The walls of the Gwalior fort, including the Elephant's Gate, predate the Mughals, as does most of the palace. They were built in the 15th century by the local Tomar rulers. And I think it was in 1529 that Babur was entertained in the governor's Chahārbāgh outside the Elephant Gate, which is just, you can't see it, but it's here. So I guess he meant somewhere in the plain or on the slope. On the eve of the entertainment in the governor's Chahārbāgh, Babur spent the night in a bagche inside the Gwalior palace. Note the consistency in vocabulary. And after the entertainment, he rejoined the army, which was encamped in what Babur calls alternatively the Chahārbāgh or my own garden. The suggestion of a political and ceremonial dimension to the Chahārbāghs sheds new light on various passages in the sources. For example, Babur tells us that news of his father's death reached him in the Chahārbāgh at Andijan. At the time, Babur was the governor of Andijan, and what he's signaling, I believe, in this passage is that he was busy conducting some administrative business, as was his duty, as he received the news, not reveling, as scholars have so far assumed. It's true that he's very personal, but saying, you know, I was having a party with my friends when they told me my father had died. Well, I don't know. Then there is his famous passage about his disappointment with Hindustan as he arrived in Agra after his victory over Ibrahim Lodi in 1527. Babur and his followers settled across the river from the city of Agra, so the fortress, and this is the area that was developed. Maybe we could look at this first. Here, this area. So the area was developed into a suburb that became known as Kabul. It is interesting to try and read this passage as reflecting Babur's preoccupation to create a suitable residence-cum-administrative center rather than a replica of paradise. In addition, note again the similarity with the vocabulary used in the Irshad az-Zira. The core of the passage reads, "A few days after coming to Agra, I crossed the Jamna with this plan in mind and scouted around for places to build gardens, bagh. But everywhere I looked was so unpleasant and desolate that I crossed back in great disgust. Because the place was so ugly and unpleasant, I abandoned my dream, khayal, of making a Chahārbāgh. Although there was no really suitable place near Agra, there was nothing to do but work with the space we had. The foundation was the large well from which the water for the bathhouse came. Next, the patch of ground with tamarind trees and octagonal pond became the great pool and courtyard. Great pool is Ulug house, and courtyard is Sah. Then came the pool in front of the stone building and the hall. Stone building, Tash Imarat. The pool is house, and the hall is Talar, which is an Indian word, or a word specific to Mughal context. After that came the private garden, and again it's the Khalvat Khane. So this is for the harem, as we know from Kabul. And it's outbuildings, and this word that Wheeler Tax and translators outbuildings is ui. You were telling me the other day we exchanged, so houses. So probably the apartments for the ladies, I think, if my interpretation is correct. After that came the bathhouse. Thus, in the unpleasant and inharmonious India, marvelously regular and geometric gardens, and here it's Baghche, because it's what his nobles built along the riverfront, were introduced. And Babur uses tarh and siyaq, which are two keywords also in the Irshad az-Zira for the regularly laid out. In every corner were beautiful plots, chamanlar. And in every plot were regularly laid out arrangements of roses and narcissus. So it's really the same vocabulary that recurs. Elsewhere too, Babur refers to the gardens built by his emirs as Baghche. The foundations along Agra's waterfront continued to be called this way. A trace of Babur's own Chahārbāgh survived at least until the 18th century. Ebba Koch, in her book, The Complete Taj Mahal, has used the information in textual sources and in this famous 18th century map in the Jaipur Palace Museum to reconstruct the riverfront of Agra in Mughal times. Her focus is mostly on the 17th century, when a number of gardens were added to or redeveloped along the riverfront, most notably the Taj Mahal, of course, which was to affect that landscape in unprecedented ways. But her research also includes information on the early Mughal settlement on the Yamuna's left bank. In the Jaipur map, two large rectangular plots I've lost it, on the more or less across the river from the Taj Mahal, are labeled respectively Chahārbāgh-e-Padshahi, Royal Chahārbāgh, and Chahārbāgh-e-Padshahi-e-Sani, so second Royal Chahārbāgh. In the immediate vicinity is a congregational mosque that bears a date corresponding to 1530, and it's here on the map. There's a small village called Kachpura, and the mosque dated 1530 is found here. suggesting this was indeed the site of the early Mughal settlement. But why two Chahārbāghs? Well, we know that Babur's own Chahārbāgh became his tomb, as he was laid to rest there in 1530. His body was transferred to Kabul 10 years later, only as a result of Humayun's defeat and exile, as I explain in an article. I forgot to put a slide on that, but I can give you the reference if you're interested. What is relevant to our topic today is that I believe Babur's body was never meant to be transferred to Kabul. It just happened as a result of political circumstances, as I explained in that article. So if the first Chahārbāgh was turned into a funerary complex, since a Chahārbāgh is mentioned in Humayuni sources, then another Chahārbāgh had to be built for the requirements of the court. And the reason the two Chahārbāghs then fell into oblivion, and the reason Chahārbāghs disappear altogether from Mughal chronicles, I'm here arguing, is because Akbar's reforms of ceremonial dispensed with the function of the Chahārbāgh and shifted court routine to the palace in accordance with Hindustani practice. A transition may actually be detected as early as Humayun's reign, because Humayun crossed the river twice a week by boat to attend to state affairs on Sundays and to administer justice on Tuesdays. We should also consider that in 1534, Humayun began building a new city in Delhi, the city of Din Panah. Even though the project was never completed, the city of Din Panah, and more generally the decision to move the court to Delhi, the ancient capital of the sultans of Hindustan, would seem to signal Humayun's acceptance of local traditions, only 3 years after his accession. And it is remarkable indeed that no Chahārbāgh is ever mentioned in Mughal Delhi. In Akbari sources, the word Chahārbāgh is selectively employed in connection with episodes from the lives of Babur and Humayun. Akbar instead chose to reside in the Agra citadel, in the fort, which he refurbished and rebuilt. And soon he too built a new city, Fatpur, as expected of an Indian ruler. This interpretation, and my interpretation of the Chahārbāgh more generally, would, if accepted, finally solve a conundrum pointed out by Ebba Koch in her scholarship, namely the already cited fact that Chahārbāghs in the early Mughal period do not seem four-part gardens, and more importantly, as she notes in her book on the Taj Mahal, none of the 17th century Mughal gardens, despite their cross-axial plan, is ever called a Chahārbāgh. The word only survives in court panegyrics in metaphors relating to government. So I think that Chahārbāgh was the locus of authority. It was like saying the court, the king on the throne holding court. Okay, now, and these Chahārbāghs are rectangular, although it's very schematic, so we can't take that at face value. So to conclude, if the Chahārbāgh is a historical phenomenon, let's now try and define its chronological limits. The Chahārbāgh's connections seem to be mostly with Khorasan. Although the word Chahārbāgh itself would seem to gain currency only in the 15th century, large estates with a pavilion on a raised platform at one end were already present in Khorasan in Ghaznavid times, and their connection with court routine appears very similar. The details of ceremonial were different, of course, and the gardens are known as Bagh, not Chahārbāgh. And actually, I've counted over 80 references to baghs in Baihaqi, many of which are multiple references to the same few gardens. By contrast, interestingly, although it ended up in the Dekhoda, there's only one reference to a Chahārbāgh, a fact which seems strange to me because it's sort of out of the blue, and perhaps, despite the fact that much has been made of it, it may result from interpolation. But of course, this is provisional conclusion. One has to read many more sources from the intervening periods, and basically at some point in a passage it is said, and then Sultan Masood purchased some land to build a Chahārbāgh. So it's, even without that line, the passage runs anyway. In any case, the connection with Khorasan I think is pretty strong, and Khorasan of course then would bring us back to the Ghaznavids and the Samanids anyway. The Chahārbāgh as a garden type and as an institution appears to have survived under the successive states of the Timurids, the Shaybanids, the Safavids, and the Mughals. At this stage, my understanding of the Chahārbāgh in the Shaybanid context is still imperfect, but the concept did survive there, both as a ceremonial space and as a site of intensive high-yield agriculture. And there's a stronger emphasis on the second aspect because of the kind of sources that we have for Bukhara, which are mostly documents from the Jujbari archive. So they list meticulously what crops were grown and how many trees there were and so forth. If the Mughals discontinued the use of the Chahārbāghs, the Safavids reinvented them. Tahmasp, who had spent time in Herat in his childhood, was well aware of the role of Chahārbāghs, and this is reflected in the Farman that we've already cited. But perhaps the most interesting implication of this new interpretation of the Chahārbāgh, if confirmed and if accepted, is when we examine Shah Abbas's Isfahan, where I would propose to consider the possibility that the name of the Khiyabān-e Chahārbāgh actually refers to the fact that the Khiyabān was leading to the suburban estate of the Hizar Jarib, which was the Chahārbāgh in Shah Abbas's time. I've not, speaking of terminology, I've not mentioned this, but Khiyabāns were present, well, certainly in Ghazvin. On the Safavid side, the Khiyabān was one of the main landmarks of Herat. Visitors, including Babur, were promenaded across the Khiyabān all the way from the city to the suburban estates. So this would index a long tradition, Safavid and pre-Safavid. But in Isfahan, this was further transformed because the Khiyabān became lined with what the Tarikh-e Abbasi calls Chahārbāghs, even though they are small gardens built by the nobility, which in the Mughal context would have been called Baghche. And I think it's because they were used for receptions. Think of what Isfahan was all about. So it's a creative reinterpretation, I think, if I'm right here. And let us not forget that Shah Abbas had been brought up in Herat, among other things. Two more Chahārbāghs were then built in Isfahan. The Sa'adat Abad by Shah Abbas II in the mid-17th century, and the Farahabad of Shah Sultan Hussein in the early 18th. And I would suggest you take a look at those two books on Isfahan, Blake's book and Babai's book, both excellent works, and try and read the passages on the Chahārbāgh, replacing the assumption that these were just pleasure gardens or even paradise gardens with this interpretation, and a lot of things will start to make new sense. Well, okay, this is, if it's time for a discussion, if you like. Don't throw eggs at me.